Every day, when the sun started to dip below the horizon, a young boy would sit on the corner near a busy grocery store. His clothes were torn, his hair unkempt, and his eyes hollow with hunger. No one ever really noticed him, except for one person, the black cashier at the store. For months, this cashier, a woman with a kind face and a heart that seemed too big for the world, would quietly notice the boy sitting there. She couldn't just walk by. She saw the sadness in his eyes and felt a pull to help him. Each day, without fail, as soon as she saw the boy, she would walk over to him, her hands holding a small brown paper bag. Inside, there was always a loaf of bread, just bread. It wasn't much, but to the boy, it meant everything. He would look up at her with gratitude, sometimes too shy to speak, but always with a silent thanks in his eyes. She'd smile, pat him on the shoulder, and go back to work. The routine continued day after day, week after week. The boy never asked for more. He never seemed to expect anything else. But that bread, that small act of kindness, was his lifeline. Over time, the other customers at the store began to notice. Some gave curious glances, others didn't understand. But no one ever stopped the cashier. It was her quiet ritual, one that became a part of the rhythm of her life. She didn't know the boy's story. She didn't know why he was there, why he didn't have a home, or who he was, but she saw his need, and that was enough. One chilly evening, just as the cashier was about to leave, she saw something different. The boy wasn't sitting on the usual corner. He wasn't there at all. At first, she thought maybe he had simply moved on, but something about the emptiness of the space where he once sat felt wrong. She asked around, but no one had seen him. The customers who'd become familiar with her little routine noticed too. They started asking questions. Days turned into weeks, and the boy never returned. The cashier felt a pang of worry, but she continued her days, doing what she did best, helping those in need, even if she didn't always know how. She couldn't shake the feeling, though, that something was left unfinished. She felt like she had missed a chance to learn more about him, to offer something deeper than just bread. But the world, busy and indifferent, didn't have time for such thoughts. Life moved on. Months passed. The cashier's life continued, full of the usual bustle. She never forgot the boy, but she had to move forward. Then one afternoon, a sudden knock on the door of the store's back office stopped her in her tracks. She opened the door, expecting a delivery or a staff member, but what she saw was nothing like that. Standing before her was a man, a well-dressed man with a confident smile, carrying something in his hands. He looked at her with an odd mix of recognition and curiosity. "I'm here about the boy," he said, his voice steady but with a hint of something she couldn't quite place. The word sent a ripple of shock through her. The boy. Was he in trouble? Was he okay? The man continued, "I've been looking for you. The boy. He's no longer the way you remember him." His gaze softened as he noticed the sudden shift in her expression. She tried to gather herself, but the news was like a punch to the gut. What had happened? Where was he now? "Are you the one who used to bring him bread?" the man asked, studying her closely. She nodded, her mind racing with questions. Why was he asking about her? And what did he mean by "he's no longer the way you remembered him"? The man explained, but the details were more shocking than she could have imagined. What she had done for that boy had changed everything, changed him in ways she couldn't possibly have known. The small, simple act of buying him bread had set off a chain of events, a story that no one could have predicted. And now, months later, something was happening. Something big. Something that was going to change her life forever. But the man wasn't done yet. He paused, as if weighing whether he should share more. And then he looked straight at her, a serious expression taking over his face. "You won't believe what's happened. The boy, he's been transformed. He's no longer that hungry child you gave bread to. Well, let's just say he's about to make a lot of people take notice." And just like that, the room was filled with questions, confusion, and a growing sense of something extraordinary. What had happened to the boy? How could something so small, so simple, lead to such an unexpected turn of events? And why was the man standing there, telling her this now, after all this time? The cashier stood frozen, trying to make sense of what she had just heard. But no matter how hard she tried, one thing was clear: the boy's story wasn't over, and it was about to take a turn she could never have imagined. The cashier couldn't shake the words from her mind. "He's no longer the way you remember him." The man's voice echoed in her head as she stared at him, trying to process what he had just said. Her eyes darted to the brown paper bag he held in his hands, and for a moment, it felt as though the world had slowed down. The moment of quiet was broken by a sudden question she hadn't expected. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. She had always prided herself on her ability to stay composed, but this situation was beyond anything she could have imagined. The man in front of her wasn't some stranger off the street. He seemed to know everything about her. Her routine, her quiet act of kindness to the boy, the bread. It all seemed to have connected in ways that felt too complicated to untangle. The man set the brown bag down on the counter. He leaned against it, his gaze now softer, like someone who had seen much more of the world than they ever wanted to. "My name's not important," he said, his tone heavy with an unspoken weight. "What matters is what happened to that boy." She blinked, trying to hold on to something familiar. "What happened to him?" she asked again, her voice barely above a whisper. Her heart raced as she thought of the boy, wondering if he was okay. He hadn't been in front of the store in months, and she feared the worst. Had something terrible happened? Was he lost, hurt, or worse? The man seemed to sense her panic, and his expression softened. "He's not the same boy anymore," he repeated. "He's become something else entirely." She stared at him, not sure what to believe. The boy had never spoken to her much, but there had always been an unspoken bond between them. She had never known his name or what had brought him to that corner, but she had seen the pain in his eyes and wanted to ease it, even if just for a moment. She never imagined that her simple act of buying him bread could lead to something bigger. "Months ago," the man continued, his voice growing quieter, "the boy started changing. People noticed it, but no one knew what was happening. One day, he didn't just accept the bread anymore. He started asking questions. He wanted to know more about you." The man paused, as if remembering something important. "He asked how you could be so kind to someone like him, a stranger." The cashier's heart tightened. It was strange, she thought. The boy had never asked her anything. He was always so quiet, so distant. But now, as the man spoke, she realized how much she had taken for granted. The boy had been more than just a hungry child on the street. He had been someone who, despite his circumstances, cared about the world in his own way. Then, one day, he disappeared. The man went on. But it wasn't like he had just walked away. It was as if he had transformed. People say he became different overnight. No one could find him. No one could track him down. His eyes met hers. And now, well, he's not the same boy. He's become someone who can't be ignored. The cashier felt a chill run through her. "What do you mean?" she asked, barely able to keep the words from tumbling out in a rush. "What happened to him?" The man hesitated. "You'll see soon enough. He's about to make his presence known. But I can tell you this, what he's become isn't something you can ignore. He's powerful now. Too powerful for anyone to stop." She tried to process his words, but everything was moving too fast. The boy she had once given bread to, had somehow transformed into something unrecognizable. The thought sent a wave of unease over her. What could he have become? And why did the man say she would soon see? She felt the weight of his words press down on her chest. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked, struggling to keep her voice steady. "Why now? After all this time?" The man took a long breath, his eyes darkening. "Because you're connected to him," he said. "You don't know it yet, but your act of kindness changed everything." It set something in motion. And now, there's no turning back. The room felt colder as the man spoke, and she felt as though the walls were closing in around her. She had always believed that her small act of helping a child was just that, small. But now, it seemed as though she had been a part of something much bigger than she could have ever imagined. She glanced at the brown bag on the counter again, the bread inside looking almost too simple for the gravity of the situation. Could something so small, so simple, really have set off a chain of events like this? She had given that boy bread every day without expecting anything in return. She had simply wanted to help, and now it seemed as though that kindness had led to something far more complex than she could understand. The man seemed to notice her confusion. "Don't think that you're the only one who's been watching," he said softly. "There are others. People who know what he's become and what he's capable of. Some are scared. Some are trying to control him. And some," he paused, "some want to use him." The words sent a shiver through her. She suddenly felt a weight of responsibility on her shoulders, like she had unknowingly opened a door to something she couldn't close. The boy she had given bread to, was now a key figure in something much larger than the simple world she knew. "What do I do?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. The man smiled, but it wasn't a reassuring smile. It was the kind of smile someone gives when they know something you don't. "You'll find out soon enough," he said. "But remember this, you're part of his story now. And whatever happens next, it all began with that bread." As the man turned to leave, the cashier stood frozen, her mind racing. What had she done? What was about to happen? And most of all, where was the boy now? The questions piled up, and the answers seemed to slip further away, just out of reach. The cashier stood there, frozen in place, her mind racing with the man's words. "You're part of his story now." She could still hear them echoing in her head, a constant hum that grew louder with each passing second. What had she done? It was just bread. She had never thought of it as anything more than a small act of kindness. But now, the world she knew seemed to have shifted. What had the boy become? And why was she involved in whatever was happening now? The days that followed felt like they were dragging on forever. The man's visit had left her restless, full of questions and unease. She tried to go about her daily life, but everything felt different, as if the world was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. She couldn't stop thinking about the boy, about what he might have become, and what this mysterious man had meant when he said that the boy was no longer someone she recognized. Every time she went to work, she found herself glancing at the corner where the boy had always sat. The spot was always empty. It seemed like a strange emptiness had taken over the street, as though the whole world was waiting for the boy to return, but at the same time, dreading it. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, something that would change everything. Then, one evening, as the sun began to set and the streetlights flickered to life, she saw him. The boy. Or at least, it looked like him. He was standing across the street, his figure silhouetted against the fading light. For a moment, she couldn't breathe. Was it really him? The same child who had sat quietly on the corner for so long, accepting the bread she brought him. The same boy who had never asked for anything more than a simple meal. But this time, there was something different about him. His posture was straighter, more confident. He wasn't hunched over in hunger like he used to be. No, he stood tall, his eyes scanning the crowd with a sharpness she hadn't seen before. Something about the way he moved made her stomach turn. It wasn't the same child she remembered. This was someone new, someone she didn't recognize. She quickly ducked behind the counter in the store, her heart racing. What was he doing here? Why was he back now? And why did he seem so different? The boy turned and walked down the street, moving with purpose, like he knew exactly where he was going. She couldn't help herself. She followed him. The urge to understand what had happened to him was overpowering. She needed to know what had changed. She needed to know what she had gotten herself into. The boy led her through the city, down narrow alleyways and past darkened storefronts, until they arrived at a large, abandoned building on the outskirts of town. It looked as if it hadn't been touched in years. Windows shattered, walls covered in graffiti. It was a place most people would avoid, but the boy walked toward it without hesitation, like he belonged there. She stayed hidden in the shadows, watching him carefully, trying to keep her distance. Suddenly, a group of people appeared from the shadows, moving toward the boy with a strange sense of urgency. They weren't like the people she saw on the streets every day. They were different, dressed in dark, tight clothing, with an intensity in their eyes that made her shiver. The boy didn't flinch. Instead, he greeted them like old friends. They spoke to him with a level of respect she had never heard anyone use with a child. They were asking him questions, but she couldn't hear their conversation from where she stood. Her heart began to race again. Who were these people? Why were they so focused on the boy? And why did it feel like she had stumbled into something much larger than she had ever imagined? The boy raised his hand, and the group fell silent. She could barely make out what he said next, but the words that floated on the breeze were unmistakable. It's time. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up. What did he mean? It's time for what? For all these people to start listening to him, for something bigger to happen. Her mind was swirling with possibilities, each one more terrifying than the last. She wanted to run. She wanted to turn and leave, but something kept her rooted to the spot. The boy's words had sparked a fire inside her, one that couldn't be ignored. It's time. What was coming? And what part did she play in it? The group around the boy began to move, heading toward the entrance of the building. She stayed close behind, trying to remain unnoticed. She had to know what was happening. She had to understand. As they entered the building, the boy looked back briefly, his eyes scanning the shadows where she hid. Her breath caught in her throat as their gazes met. For a second, she thought he would call out to her, but instead, he simply nodded, as if acknowledging her presence without any surprise. It was as if he had known she was following him all along. She couldn't turn back now. She had already come too far. Inside the building, the air was thick with tension. There were more people gathered, their faces hard with determination, their eyes focused on the boy. She slipped in through a side door, her heart pounding in her chest. The boy stood at the front of the room, his posture commanding attention. No one spoke. They simply waited for him to give the order. She had never seen anything like this before. It was like the boy had become the leader of something much larger, something more dangerous than she could have ever imagined. The people around him weren't ordinary. These were people who had power, who had influence, and they were all listening to him. And then, without warning, the boy raised his hand again, and the room fell into complete silence. Every pair of eyes was on him, and for the first time, she understood the weight of the man's words. He's too powerful to be ignored. It was time. Something was about to happen, and she had no idea how it was all going to unfold. As the boy stood at the front of the room, his hand raised, the silence felt like a living thing, heavy with anticipation. The tension was unbearable, and the air seemed to thrum with an unspoken promise of what was to come. She could feel it, the shift in the room, the shift in everything. This wasn't just some group gathering. It was something far more dangerous. She could see the way the others looked at him, with a mix of fear and reverence, as if he were no longer a boy at all. But what had happened to him? What had he become? She couldn't move. It was like her legs had turned to stone. Her heart pounded in her chest as the boy's gaze swept across the room, pausing briefly at her hiding spot. For just a moment, their eyes met again, and she saw something in his eyes that made her blood run cold. It wasn't recognition, nor was it affection. It was something colder, something far more distant. Then, without warning, he spoke, his voice low and steady, carrying an authority that seemed to vibrate through the room. It's time for them to know. Her breath caught. Them? Who was he talking about? Her eyes darted around the room, but the others weren't paying attention to her. They were focused on him, on his every word. And then something strange happened. The walls of the building began to hum, faintly at first, then louder, like some kind of machine powering up. The floor beneath her feet seemed to shift slightly, as though the entire structure was alive. And then, the boy's next words sent a chill down her spine. "They're already here." The door behind her slammed open with a deafening crash. A group of men and women in dark, tactical gear stormed into the room, their presence commanding and oppressive. She didn't know who they were, but she could tell by the way they moved, by the way they didn't hesitate to take control, that they were dangerous. They weren't just ordinary soldiers or law enforcement. They had a sense of purpose, of urgency, as if they had been waiting for this moment. The boy didn't flinch. In fact, he didn't even seem surprised. He simply stood there, as if he had known this would happen. She felt a wave of panic rise in her chest. Who are these people? What was going on? What did the boy know that she didn't? The leader of the group stepped forward, her face obscured by a helmet. She was tall and imposing, her movements sharp and controlled. "You've done well," she said to the boy, her voice calm but cold. "We've been monitoring your progress. It's time to move forward with the plan." The boy nodded, his expression unreadable. "I'm ready." The tension in the room escalated to a fever pitch. The group seemed to be waiting for some kind of signal, and she could feel the weight of their gaze on her, as if they were aware of her presence now. She was no longer just an observer. She was part of something much larger, and that thought sent a jolt of fear through her. "What's happening?" she whispered, barely able to keep her voice steady. The woman in the dark gear turned her head, her eyes locking onto the cashier for the first time. There was something chilling about her gaze, something that made it clear she wasn't a stranger to danger. "You're in the middle of this, whether you like it or not," she said, her tone matter-of-fact. "You've unknowingly played your part. And now, you need to understand the stakes." Before she could ask any more questions, the boy raised his hand again, silencing everyone. The room fell into complete stillness, the hum of the building now deafening. "I have a message for them," the boy said. His voice was no longer that of a child. It was deeper, stronger, commanding. "Tell them that humanity will no longer be ignored." The group of soldiers and agents seemed to stiffen, their faces unreadable. The woman who had spoken earlier stepped forward, her movements swift and deliberate. "The message has already been received," she said, her voice tight. "They've been waiting for you." The boy's eyes narrowed, and he took a step forward, his gaze unblinking. "Then it's time to act." In that moment, something in the room shifted. The walls, which had once seemed like mere walls, began to shimmer, a strange energy radiating from them. The hum grew louder, almost unbearable, and suddenly the room was filled with light, sharp, blinding light that made her shield her eyes. It wasn't just the room that was changing, it was everything. The building itself seemed to pulse with an energy that wasn't of this world. She stumbled back, unsure of what was happening, and that's when she noticed it. A figure standing behind the boy, a figure that hadn't been there before. It was a woman, tall and imposing, dressed in flowing robes that seemed to ripple with an otherworldly energy. She didn't belong here, in this dim, abandoned building. Her presence was otherworldly, like something that didn't belong in this reality at all. The woman's eyes met the cashier's, and in that moment, it was as if everything clicked into place. This wasn't just a meeting of people. This wasn't just a child who had changed. This was something much larger, much more dangerous than anything she could have ever imagined. The boy, the people in tactical gear, this mysterious woman, they were all part of something that was unfolding in ways that she couldn't begin to understand. "Do you see now?" the woman asked, her voice like silk but carrying an unmistakable weight of power. "This is no longer just about bread. It's about a new order, one that you're a part of." The boy turned his head slightly, his expression unreadable, as if he had anticipated her question. "You've been the catalyst," he said quietly. "Your kindness, it's what triggered everything. And now, you're part of the plan." The room seemed to close in on her. The walls, the figures around her, all of it was overwhelming. Part of the plan. What was the plan? What was going to happen now? Before she could even think to ask another question, the woman stepped forward, raising her hand. "It's time for the next phase," she said, her voice filled with finality. The building hummed once more, and she felt a cold wave of realization flood over her. The boy, the people around him, they weren't just trying to change the world. They were about to reshape it. And she was stuck in the middle of it, with no idea how it was going to end. The hum of the building grew louder, vibrating through her chest as the woman in the flowing robes stepped forward, her gaze never leaving the cashier. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her, like the world was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The boy, now standing tall and confident, looked at her as if he were waiting for her to understand something. Something that she could no longer ignore. The woman's voice broke through the tension, cold and calm. "You've played your part in all this, whether you realized it or not. You gave him what he needed, and now the world will see the result." The words hung in the air like a threat, and the cashier's heart pounded. She still couldn't understand what she had gotten herself into, but one thing was clear. She had become a key player in something far bigger than she ever intended. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. The boy stepped forward, his eyes never leaving her. "You gave me more than bread," he said softly. "You gave me the strength to move beyond what I was. And now I have to finish what I started." The room was thick with tension. The others in the room stood perfectly still, like statues, waiting for the boy's next command. She could feel their eyes on her, each one filled with a mixture of anticipation and dread. The hum of the building was now deafening, the walls shimmering as though they were no longer solid. The energy in the room had shifted into something far more dangerous, far more powerful. Then, without warning, the figure of the woman in the robes raised her hands, and the light around them intensified. The entire building seemed to pulse with energy, and for a moment it felt like the very air was alive. "Now," the woman said, her voice low but filled with power, "we reveal the truth." Before anyone could react, the boy raised his hand, and the room seemed to freeze in place. The woman's face twisted into a mask of surprise, her hand still raised in the air. The boy, with a calmness that unsettled the cashier, spoke again. "I'm not the one you think I am." The words hit like a punch to the gut. The woman's eyes widened, and she took a step back. The others in the room shifted, uncertain now. The boy wasn't just in control of the situation. He had completely turned it on its head. "What do you mean?" the woman demanded, her voice shaking. The boy's gaze never left hers. "I'm not one of them. I'm not what you've been waiting for." The shock in the room was palpable. The others were silent, confusion spreading like wildfire. The woman in the robes took a step toward him, her face twisted in anger and disbelief. "What are you saying? You were the chosen one. You." "I was," the boy interrupted, his voice firm. But not anymore. The room seemed to tilt as everything began to change. The walls, the people, everything around them felt less real, as if it were all just a facade. The energy in the room surged, and the cashier felt her knees weaken. The hum grew louder, and the air seemed to thicken with an electric charge. But it wasn't just the room that was shifting. Something far deeper was happening. Something within the boy had changed. The woman lunged at him, her hand reaching out to grasp his shoulder, but he was too fast. In an instant, the boy was no longer standing where he had been. The room flickered, and he appeared in a different spot, his eyes glowing with an intensity that was both terrifying and awe-inspiring. "I'm not the person you think I am," the boy repeated, his voice carrying an almost unnatural power. "I never was. I've been playing a part, just like all of you." The room erupted into chaos. The others began shouting, demanding answers, but the boy was already steps ahead of them. He raised his hand once more, and the building responded. The walls cracked open, revealing a hidden chamber beneath them. one that no one had known existed. The woman's eyes locked onto the open space, her expression turning from fury to fear. "Impossible," she whispered. "No one should know about this place." But the boy was no longer listening. He was already moving toward the chamber, and as he did, the light in the room seemed to flicker, then fade to darkness. The hum stopped abruptly, and the sudden silence was deafening. The woman looked at the others, her expression one of desperation. "Get him," she ordered. But it was too late. The boy had already entered the chamber, and with a single word, the room was sealed. The cashier stood frozen, her mind racing, trying to make sense of everything that had just happened. She had never imagined this. She had never expected to find herself in the middle of something so explosive, so completely out of her control. What had the boy meant when he said he wasn't who they thought he was? And what had he just unleashed by opening that hidden chamber? Then a voice broke through the silence, soft at first, then louder as it filled the space around them. It was the boy's voice, but it wasn't coming from the boy. It was as if he was speaking through the very walls themselves, the sound echoing from every corner of the room. "You've been playing a part in something much bigger than you realized," the voice said. "But now, the game has changed." The tension in the room was unbearable. The woman, now clearly panicked, turned to the others, her voice breaking. "We've made a mistake," she said, her hands trembling. "We were never supposed to wake him up. He was never meant to." Before she could finish, the building shook again. The walls trembled as if the very foundation of the world was crumbling beneath them. The chamber was still sealed, but the boy's voice continued to echo, filling the space with an ominous warning. "It's too late," the voice said. "The truth has already been set in motion. There's no turning back." And then, with a final, deafening crash, the lights went out completely. The room was plunged into darkness, and the world outside seemed to hold its breath. The unexpected twist hit like a wave. In that moment, everything the cashier thought she knew about the boy, about the world, about herself, was shattered. The room was silent, but the air buzzed with the weight of what was to come. And now, there was no escaping it. The silence was overwhelming. The air felt thick, charged with an energy that seemed to crackle around them. It was as though the entire world had held its breath, waiting for something to break. The boy's voice continued to echo in the dark, but now it wasn't just a warning, it was a promise. For a moment, everything stood still. The woman in the robes, the others in the room, even the cashier, were frozen in the darkness. The room hummed softly now, as though something deep within the building was awakening. And then, with a deep, resonating thrum, the lights flickered back on. The boy was standing in the center of the room, his hands raised, as if nothing had changed. His eyes still glowed with that same unsettling intensity, but there was something else there now, something softer, almost like regret. The woman who had tried to control him earlier stood in front of him, frozen, her eyes wide with realization. "You were never meant to control me," the boy said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of 1,000 unspoken truths. "I am not the weapon you thought I was. I'm the one who decides what happens next." The woman's face twisted, a mixture of fury and helplessness. She took a step forward, but then stopped. Something in the air had shifted. It was as though the very essence of power had slipped away from her. The boy's gaze never wavered. "You've been using people for your own agenda," he continued, his voice now steady, calm. "But I won't be part of that anymore." The room was eerily silent as the boy's words sank in. The others, who had once looked at him with fear and awe, now stood in uncertain disbelief. No one spoke, but the tension in the room was palpable. The energy from the chamber still lingered, vibrating through the floor and walls, but now it seemed less menacing, more like a fading echo of something that had already passed. The cashier, who had been standing on the edge of the room, watching the entire scene unfold, felt something shift inside her. It was as if the weight that had been pressing down on her heart had finally lifted. She hadn't known it, but she had played a part in something much bigger than she had ever imagined. She had been a catalyst, a spark that had set this entire chain of events in motion. But she wasn't just a bystander anymore. She was a part of this story now. As she watched the boy and the woman face off, she realized that everything had been leading to this moment. All those mornings, all those little gestures of kindness, buying the boy bread, offering him a smile, had led her here, to this moment where everything was about to change. She didn't fully understand it all, but she knew one thing: the world was no longer the same, and neither was she. The boy took a deep breath, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. He stepped toward the woman, his expression now calm, almost serene. "This ends now," he said, his voice final. "No more manipulation. No more control. We're done with that." The woman's eyes flickered with something. Fear, uncertainty, but there was also a sense of defeat. She could feel it too. The world she had been building, the power she had once wielded so effortlessly, was crumbling around her. The boy had taken that power away, not with violence, but with truth. And the truth was more powerful than anything she had ever anticipated. There was a long pause. Then, without warning, the boy turned and walked toward the hidden chamber. The others followed him with hesitant steps, their expressions a mixture of confusion and reluctant respect. The woman remained where she was, her shoulders sagging as though the weight of her entire world had just been lifted from her. The boy stopped just before entering the chamber and turned to face the woman one last time. "You'll have to find another way," he said softly. "This one is over." And with that, he stepped into the chamber, leaving the woman and the others standing in the room. The door behind him closed with a soft click, and for a moment there was nothing but silence. The cashier, still standing near the wall, finally took a deep breath. She had been holding it in for so long, unsure of what was happening, of what would happen next. But now, everything seemed clearer. She didn't know what the future would hold, but she knew that whatever it was, it would be shaped by the choices they had made, the choices she had made. As she stepped toward the door, she caught one last glimpse of the woman in the robes. The woman's expression was one of resignation, as if she too understood that her time had passed. The others were already moving, some with purpose, others still unsure of what to do next. But the power that had once filled the room, the tension that had seemed so suffocating, was gone. It had been replaced by something new, a possibility, an open door. The cashier didn't know where it would lead. She didn't have all the answers. But as she stepped outside into the sunlight, she realized something important. The world was full of moments, moments when one choice could change everything. She had made her choice, and now the world was going to change, whether she was ready for it or not. As she walked away from the building, her heart still racing from the intensity of what had just happened, she felt a strange sense of peace. The boy, the woman, the others, they were all gone now, but she would never forget what had happened. And in some way, she knew that the boy's journey was far from over. It had only just begun. The world was waiting for whatever came next. And so was she.